So what we're going to try to cover today, if we don't get it, we'll kind of roll it over as we have this one. By the way, thank you guys for helping me get all of my slides together for the Sermon on the Mount, because I know you haven't got a copy, but we'll send you a full copy out when this is over so that you've got the full set. But I'm really seeing the opportunity to maybe create some weekend opportunities for churches just to spend time on the Sermon on the Mount. And Shannon, I'm even thinking we really ought to have a PACE course that's basically Sermon on the Mount, because all of these topics could go in so many different areas and you can research them back into the Old Testament. We've only been able to touch on them a little bit along the way. So we're basically going to touch chapter 7 here, and then we're going to move into these, which originally I called the conclusion, but really, again, I think be this, not that, will actually cover almost everything that's in here. So let's start with the section we called various teachings. I've called it various teachings on discernment. That'll hold those first 12 verses together. And so Jesus says, by the way, it's always good to look at where we were before. The last thing Jesus said was seek the kingdom of heaven. Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. That's what I'm going to say is the kind of the header of this section. And then what we have in verses 3 through 5 is an illustration. How do you practice this? What does this look like? Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brothers, let me take the speck out of your eye, when all the time there is a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite. By the way, hypocrite means one who judges unfairly, right? Critus, you hear the word criticism in there. First, take the plank out of your own eye, then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. I want you to see this, although I know you probably can't read it, but if you can, God bless you. I want you to see that in the English, the word judge, count them, judge 1, 2, 3, 4. I count 4 words related to the word judge. In the Greek text, because it uses the verb for judging, it actually gets 5 times. And so the red text in the Greek text is 5 times the word judge or judgment used. And then the measure part, there's actually three words connected to measuring. And so the Greek would literally be, do not judge so that you might not be judged. For in the judgment you judge, you will be judged. And then the rest of it says, and in the measure you measure, you will be measured, or it will be measured to you. And so also notice that in terms of translation, it takes more English words than it does Greek words to spit this out, which makes it in the original really pithy. So don't judge or you will be judged, for in the judgment you're judged, for the judgment you judge, you will be judged. And so you get this rhythm, and in the measure you measure, it will be measured to you. I don't really have a lot to say about this text other than it tends to get used as a blank statement that we shouldn't judge at all. And that's not, when you read the entire context, it's not saying kick your brain into underdrive. It's actually saying don't be don't be hypercritical of others. And particularly don't be critical of others unless you're willing to do a similar self-assessment of yourself. Notice that there's passives here. You will be judged and you will be measured. It's left open on whether that's other people or God. And I can make an application that goes both ways. When you treat other people harshly, do not be surprised that others treat you harshly. But there's something gracious about who we become in Jesus, so that we should not be the folks that are being the overly critical ones. And by the way, we're actually nurtured in Western culture to be overly critical. Take any post on Facebook and you'll find people acting it out for us in front of us. By the way, Jesus here is not inconsistent with what you already find in the Torah. You shall not hate in your heart any one of your kin. You shall reprove your neighbor, or you will incur guilt yourself. And so here's here's a text from the Old Testament that grabs both sides of it. Side one is you shouldn't hate people. Side two, it's okay to correct your neighbor if it's for their good. And so Jesus is certainly not, when you take the full evidence of the New Testament, telling us never to find or he's certainly not telling us never to correct another person. But he is telling us to go deep to our heart about motive. And by the way, just kind of an interesting psychological reality of who we are as people. We tend to be most unnerved by people doing the things that we do. It's just a good reminder that the things that we want to poke on are usually our things. But anyway, so one way of reframing his statement, according to Amy Levine, is to move from do not judge to do not be judgmental. I think that really captures the spirit of it. Fault finding or hypercritical. Therefore, do not judge means, and I think she's framed it really well here, means that you do not put yourself in the role of God. And that's a reminder all through Scripture is that God is the ultimate judge. It does mean do not presume to know what's in someone's heart. And so I would say that when we do have an encounter in which we need to help another, the spirit has to be right. Also, you'll find in Paul, Romans 2, he uses as one of his big turning point arguments in the book of Romans. Therefore, you have no excuse, whoever you are, when you judge others, for in passing judgment on one another, you condemn yourself because you, the judge, are doing the very same things. By the way, if you read the book contextually, Paul is actually poking on the Jewish element of his audience at that point for being very hard on the Gentiles. But that's a whole nother conversation about Romans. There is this great chapter, folks, great couple of chapters, actually. It's 14 and 15 in Romans, where Paul is trying to take the various house churches that make up the Roman church. By the way, you can get a sense of how many house churches there are in Rome by going to the very last chapter, Romans chapter 16, where Paul actually greets various folks that make up the house church community in Rome. But in Romans 14, he actually introduces this notion about not getting unnerved by the things that don't really ultimately matter. And he deals there specifically with some Christians want to celebrate certain holidays. Some Christians want to eat certain food, not eat certain food. And Paul goes into an extended conversation about how these lesser matters are not as important as the kingdom of God. And so if you want a good sense of early Christians working through this notion of not being judgmental, Romans 14 and 15, great material. But we're doing Sermon on the Mount.
Stan, Ed has a comment. Paul and John ask us to gently bring someone caught up in sin back to a right standing. Yep. Determining that someone is caught up in a sin requires judgment.
It does require judgment, yeah. Mm-hmm. But again, I think Jesus is dealing in the Sermon on the Mount with there's certain people who thinks that they think they get extra points in life for being critical of others. And so we're not to be those people, which means that we're, to use Paul's language from Philippians, we're really always trying to think in terms of what's praiseworthy and noteworthy and good and wholesome. So, yeah, but at nowhere, in fact, the very thought of not being judgmental here requires judgment. The very text actually requires you to be mentally engaged in what Jesus is inviting us into.
Stan, Bill has a
yeah,
large...
Bill, go for it.
I was just noting a couple of other things from Paul in Romans.
Yeah.
Chapter 16, he talks about watch out for those who are contrary to the teaching you have learned. Keep away from them.
Yep.
He also instructs the Corinthian church, to beware of one who is calls himself a brother but is immoral, greedy, idolater, so on.
Yep.
Such a man do not even eat.
Yep.
Obviously, these commands require careful and proper judgment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Bill, one of the places I like to help people in their journey is when they're working through issues of reconciliation, and their hope is that reconciliation will somehow fully restore a relationship, but not always is that the case. There is no need for you to step back in front of the truck once it's run you over once. And I think one can be of a forgiving heart, but one needs a bit of a discernment. Please don't get back in front of the truck that's already run over you once. By the way, the very next text, which is on your screen now, but actually invites us to be discerning. Do not give dogs what is sacred. Do not throw your pearls to pigs. If you do, they may trample them under their feet and turn and tear you to pieces. So in this verse, Jesus is actually saying we do need a level of discernment. And by the way, notice that the title, discernement and proclaiming the gospel, that may be right, but Jesus doesn't put that label on it. I think it may be just a more general rule of judgment, which is basically, don't teach a pig to sing. It will frustrate you and it will annoy the pig. If somebody does not want what we have to offer, be okay with that. Jesus was, on a number of occasions, Jesus, when people walked away, they walked away. It was their call. I did gather a little bit of background. So here's some background for you on this. Let me correct some bad things. For example, no, Jews did not typically call Gentiles dogs. You'll hear that over and over again. No, basically anybody in the ancient world who wanted to insult somebody could use the word dog. So it is an insult, but there's really not a lot of evidence that Jews typically called Gentiles dogs. I'm going to move to the answering Father one. But basically, I've always read these texts together, that is, I'm not to judge, but I'm to be smart in my discernment. So I'm not to judge in the hypocritical way, but I'm to be smart in my judgment. So I think these texts certainly go together. And I think if you understand Jesus in the general sense, don't waste your time. Don't waste your time when people don't value what you're trying to offer. Can you live with that one? Yeah, I kind of think that's where he's going. The application, by the way, the connection with pigs and dogs, there's a connection in 1 Peter about the person who returns to sin is like a pig wallowing or like a dog. And so these analogies come. I think this is just proverbial wisdom that's tied with kind of balancing the text that says, do not judge, but be smart with what you have. How's that? Ask and it will be given to you. Moving to the next text. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be open to you. For everyone who asks receives, and the one who seeks finds, and the one who knocks, the door will be opened. By the way, I think that's the key text here. It's kind of a step back to the conversation around prayer. But then what follows in 9 through 11 is actually kind of the application illustration here. Which of you, rhetorical question, right? Which of you, if your son asked for bread, would give him a stone? Or if he asked for a fish, would give him a snake? If you then, though you are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more, by the way, a very Jewish argument, if this is true, how much more is this true? How much more will your Father in heaven give good gifts to those who ask him? Ask, seek, and knock are metaphors in the first century. You can find it in various places for petitioning. It's basically prayer. And what I think you need to note, and let me back up to the last slide, is notice that the emphasis on each of these is that you will get. Ask and you will get, seek and you will get, knock and you will get. For everyone who asks receives, the one who seeks finds, and the one who knocks, the door will be opened. I was looking at one commentator who made this in the general sense that if we asked each other, we would get. But I believe because of the context of Luke, that Jesus is primarily reflecting on prayer. And by the way, let me just kind of make the loop. Often prayers are answered by one another in the Christian community. So it's not so far out of range to say that. One of the things that I want to share with you is, and we don't often do this, but I want to put the Matthew version and the Luke version of the same saying side by side. And I want you to notice that Luke makes an interesting interpretation. And of course, I've highlighted it in red, so your eyes go right to it. But when Matthew says the Father in heaven gives you good gifts, notice that in Luke's rendition of the same saying, how much more will your Father in heaven give the Holy Spirit to those who ask him? And so it appears to me, now Luke's got a particular interest in the role of the Holy Spirit in the coming movie, leading from the birth of Jesus to the time of Pentecost. But notice that when Luke passes this teaching on, it is God's ultimate good gift that God wants to give us. Now, I think it's entirely possible Jesus said it in both ways, simply because Jesus probably preached this material many times, but it is interesting to see that. Also, there's a little bit of a different illustration, an egg and a scorpion, but the texts are really pretty much parallel to each other. And Luke's context is so clear that it's about prayer that I think that's probably the best way to understand this saying. It is about prayer. And so God, who is, again, the evil part there is a comparative part. It's not saying you are evil in the Calvinistic way and you're doomed. No, what's going on here is he's making a comparison. If us compared to God are evil, and I think that, we can get that comparison, and we know how to give good gifts, the point is how much more, very Jewish argument, how much more will your Father in heaven know to give you good gifts? It's also continued kind of connecting back to chapter 6, this continued push to being eager to ask. And the way I preach this text when I do Luke's version is one should be eager to pray because God is overly eager to give, which is kind of unlike the way we often view God. God is actually eager to give. And so again, the theme is be this, not that. So be what? Be generous, but also understand that God is generous. And then this was followed up with something of a summary statement. In some ways, it's a way of catching the breath. By the way, this fits so well with Matthew 5 that Jesus came to fulfill the law. So in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you, for this sums up the law and the prophets. And you'll find several of these statements. Some of you guys that had pulled Paul, you can find Paul talking about what summarizes the law, what makes up the law in that case. I want to just pull a couple of random places for you that you wouldn't likely go. This is Tobit. Tobit is one of the Apocrypha books. So it traveled with the Septuagint, so the early Christians would have known it. And this is instructions that Tobit gives to his son. Do not keep over until the next day the wages of those who work for you, but pay them at once. Very consistent with Torah. If you serve God, you will receive payment. Sounds a bit like the Sermon on the Mount a little bit. Watch yourself, my son, in everything you do, and discipline yourself in all your conduct. And what you hate, do not do to anyone. And then it goes on with other instructions. Do not drink wine to excess, or lest drunkenness go with you on your way. But this notion of not doing evil to others or doing as you would want people to treat you is not really something new with Jesus. but Jesus enforces it. In fact, it's consistent with Torah. But it does show us, the reason I quote it is it shows us that this kind of thinking is already present in the days of Jesus among Jews. And this shows up in the Mishnah, which is a later document that collects Jewish traditions together, but reflects things that were current in the first century, perhaps. When a Gentile demanded, this is one of these random places in the Mishnah, convert me on condition that you teach me the entire Torah while I'm standing on one foot. Don't worry about that part. Just look at the answer. Hillel, by the way, Hillel would have been the teacher of Paul. Hillel responded, that which is hateful to you, do not do to another. And then he says, that is the entire Torah, and the rest is its interpretation. Go study. I think it's great. The 1 foot thing, I think, is just kind of the ridiculousness that Jewish arguments could sometimes go into that direction. But here we have Paul's teacher basically echoing what Jesus is saying on the Sermon on the Mount. And I think this comment from the Mishnah is also not a bad way to summarize much of the New Testament. For example, that which is hateful to you, do not do. That is the entire Torah. Do to another. The rest of it is interpretation. I would say love God and love your neighbor is what gets expanded in the rest of the teachings about that Jesus passes on to his church. And by the way, one can actually take the 10 commandments and divide them in half between loving God and loving and treating people well. And so that division even seems to exist even in the 10 commandments. Depending on where you put 5, is 5 about how you respect God by respecting your parents, or is 5 about how you treat other people? And so you've got 4 commands related to loving God, and 6. I don't know that it really matters, but you can actually feel that. You can feel that in the 10 commandments themselves. Here's how you respect God. Here's how you respect people. Or a better way to say it, this is how you respect God by respecting people. All right, let's get into the 2 ways. And by the way, the 2 ways is basically a standard teaching methodology of the ancient world. We find it in I believe it's in Wisdom of Solomon, which is again another apocryphal book from the Septuagint, but it's basically wisdom poetry. So you find this command, basically there's 2 ways to live. And so it's broad, black and white. John uses it a bit. You guys may remember, those of you that were with us, that when we did the Didache, it actually has, there are 2 ways. One way is the way of life, and one way is the way of death. I think, though, you have to hear what Jesus is about to say, not quite in the way it's traditionally read by the church. Let me see if I can get into this a little bit. Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the way that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. So there's one way that everybody's trying to pack into. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. There's 2 ways. And the way this text is nearly always taught is only those that are giving the utmost careful attention will actually get into the narrow way. That's not exactly what Jesus is saying, because Jesus is saying the Pharisees are on the broad way, and they are very careful with their details. So what kind of righteous person finds their way through the small gate and the narrow way? It would be the one whose righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees. Or, as Jesus will reflect on Hosea 6:6 twice, those that understand what it means, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. The way we tend to read this text, only those who do it exactly right will actually be on the way of the narrow way. And I don't think that's consistent with where Jesus is taking us. Another way to say this, those who make it on the narrow way are those who are loyal to Jesus. And I think that's consistent with everything Matthew's kind of revealed to us if we're kind of looking at the whole gospel. I think this might be the broad category at the top, the header paragraph, and then everything else becomes a bit of an illustration of it. Watch out for false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. By their fruit you will recognize them. And notice that you're going to hear this line again. When a biblical writer puts a line in twice, pay attention. By their fruit you will recognize them. Do people pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Likewise, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. Pretty kind of self-explanatory text, right? Illustration. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. By the way, that's literally true in the ancient world and in the modern world. If you have a bad tree, you burn it down, right? Or you destroy it. Thus, by their fruits, you will recognize them. Now, I think there's broad application that can be made of this text far beyond its original context. But I think we've got enough. We've been reading Matthew close enough. The false prophets here are the religious leaders of his day. They're not other people than the religious leaders. They are, in fact, the false prophets are the ones that are trying to teach them to be like, to follow the code of Moses, but they themselves are not following the code of Moses. Because they come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. It's the religious leaders of the day. That would be the original application of this text in the time of Jesus. And if you read what Jesus says about the religious leaders in the Gospel of Matthew, I think you can make a case that that's kind of the original application. Does it apply in other settings? Absolutely. Is it bigger than? Sure. But in the original context, who's walking the Broadway? Well, those who claim to be religious teachers in the first century. Who are the false prophets in the days of Jesus? Well, it's going to be the religious leaders of the day. By the way, you'll see a comment about at the end of this text about how impressed the people are with the teachings of Jesus, and it'll make a comparative comment, and we'll touch on it there. I've always noticed that folks who have a need to control others usually do have a pack with them. They form their allies before they deal with their deed. I think the key for us, though, is and by the way, this is a text about discernment, isn't it? How do you recognize false prophets? And Jesus gives us one basic text. It's in what they produce. So let me give you kind of a modern day application of this. It's time to hire a pastor, and the pastor is charismatic. But when you look at the resume, they've basically destroyed every church in their trail. But they're still very charismatic, and people really seem to like them at first. You measure people by their fruit. And the fruit that I think we can certainly say here, fruit can be used in a couple of ways. One is like the fruit might be more disciples of Jesus, but I think the fruit here is just the kind of trail they lead. And so if somebody is articulating a particular way of looking at something and it's not producing good people, by the way, that's the end game of the Christian life. That may not be glorious, but the end game is good lives that glorify God and invite others into that. We need to give probably more attention to this notion that we've been invited to live good lives. So how do you tell a false prophet? You look at the fruit. What happens around this person? What kind of people result from the ministry of this person? And it's also a good way to check yourself. This illustration of fruit as an image of production, that is, of producing what God looks for, it's pervasive. Isaiah 5 tells the story of the song of the vineyard. God comes looking to his people Judah, and he's looking for good grapes, and all he finds is bad grapes. And so this analogy, everybody in Jesus's audience would have known this, because it's kind of a typical Jewish illustration about God comes looking for fruit, and what does he find? Bad grapes. But notice that it still fits well, that kind of distinction between be this and not that. Don't be this kind of people. Don't entrust yourself to this kind of person. Don't step back in front of the truck once you've been run over once. And then now kind of a more personal turn. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Again, don't go crazy on the word will, because it sounds impossible. Jesus has actually been articulating for the last 2 chapters before this one what God expects of us. God does not expect his people to do the impossible. So, but the only ones, not everyone who comes can say, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one that does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Notice how it echoes the Lord's Prayer. Many will say to me on that day, the day of judgment, which was standard thinking in the Jewish mind, that one day God will judge everybody. Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons, and in your name perform many miracles? Another way to translate this is not get lost in the miraculous nature of this, but basically translate it, Lord, did we not do great things for you? Even in your name, didn't we do this for you? And then I will tell them plainly, I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers. One who does the will of God is one who knows God, not just information about God. And when we have in this last text here the word knew, I'm wondering if it's picking up on the intimate word know that's also used for sexual relationships in the Old Testament, because that's the word that gets used in the Old Testament for knowledge of God. To know God is to know God intimately. And so the issue here is one can work for God, but not know God. It's a good reminder. All right, we come to Jesus's last great illustration. We probably all learned a song in Vacation Bible School or something equivalent to it about wise man builds his house. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine, I want you to notice that, these words of mine. I want you to notice that. Jesus is not saying the whole Bible. He's actually telling us something about this particular sermon. Okay, therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came, the streams rose, the wind blew and beat against that house, yet it did not fall because it had its foundation on the rock. Now, Jesus is not making the comparison between him and the rock, or he's just using an illustration to tell us a principle. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain came, the streams rose, and the wind blew and beat against the house, and it fell with a great crash. And so these words of mine become the foundation on which Jesus expects his people to build their lives. And notice how specific it is to these words of mine. It's not that the other words in Matthew aren't important. There's just something special about this set of words that is foundational for the way we live. And I think one of the ways to read the Sermon on the Mount is Jesus is doing his first act of community development. He's building a community that has a certain way of living and a certain way of viewing things. And so we've talked about prayer and fasting. We've talked about giving away our goods for the good of others. We've talked about forgiveness. We've talked about anxiety. We've talked about judgment. And so one has actually the pretty good formation for what one might call a Christian politic, a way of living together. And so, which doesn't, by the way, involve the transformation of culture. That's not what we're called to do. I hope it happens, and sometimes it does happen, but we form a community that has a certain way of being with each other. And I don't know about you, but that's the community that I am drawn towards, that I long for. And even when we don't do it perfectly, I'm happy that we're even trying. And if the church would be that countercultural salt and light, in fact, see, it's all in the Sermon on the Mount, all the resources we need to talk about what God's trying to do with us. If we would just be a little bit of that salt and light, we could make a difference for someone in our place and in our time. Let me do one more text, and then I want to do one more thing after that, and then I'll open it up for conversation. Let me get back to the slides. It ends, by the way, notice that the Sermon on the Mount started with a description of the crowds plus Jesus' disciples. And here's how the text ends. And when Jesus had finished saying these things, notice the emphasis on these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching because he taught as one who had authority and not as their teachers of the law. And I think part of what that's pointing to, it may be pointing to the way he taught, that is his mannerisms of teaching. But I think it had to do with the fact that he spoke in his own voice instead of saying Rabbi so-and-so said, and Rabbi so-and-so said, and Rabbi so-and-so said. Jesus simply said, but I tell you. And so Jesus spoke from a posture that would suggest that he felt like he could help us understand the greatest of all prophets, Moses. So Jesus thought, or took the position of, I can teach you how to read Moses. That's a pretty presumptuous place. Not as one of the scribes. I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to move us to the Bible text for my last observation. Okay, you guys got my Bible program there in front of you. I want to go to the very end, although I haven't been able to do this as well as I would like, but the Sermon on the Mount is actually in conversation with the whole of Matthew. And I want to take us to the Great Commission. Then Jesus came to them and said, all authority, notice how that connects with our last text. Jesus spoke as one with authority. All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Of course, now we're dealing post-resurrected Jesus. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations. By the way, the only verb there in that sentence, the only verb in the Greek sentence is actually make disciples. Everything else is tied to it. For example, probably a more literal translation, as you go, therefore going, make disciples. And the word make is a little deceptive because it has the notion of us actually putting our hands on something and making it happen. It's actually the Greek word for teach. Basically, teach. Teach all nations, baptizing, again, another attendant behavior, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them, again, the word teaching is kind of doubled up, a different word for teaching here, which is more the instruction word, as opposed to make a disciple word, teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. I want to make a contextual observation for Matthew. I want you to imagine Matthew probably had sources. I have no doubt in my mind he had a copy of Mark. But ultimately, when he finished writing the Gospel of Matthew, it was sent out. It was an entire document. It was not sent out as part of a New Testament. Not originally. That happened later when they're collected together. I like to suggest to you that the proper way to read this contextually is that everything I have commanded you is actually contained in the Gospel of Matthew. Now, I'm not trying to discount anything else in the New Testament, but I'm saying that all you really need to be a disciple of Jesus is somehow touched upon in the Gospel of Matthew. Now, are there other things in other texts? Yes. But I'm saying when Matthew talks about these commands, these teachings, he's talking about stuff that's actually in his document. And so one could have received Matthew as a single text and have landed on this line at the end, teach them to obey everything I have commanded you. Well, where are we going to find that? Well, I think Matthew's gospel is a good place, at least a very good place to start. Does that kind of make sense on a contextual reading it as a single published document? Now I realize that it's going to be joined with Luke and John later, and there's going to be other sources for Jesus's teaching. But if you were to ask Matthew, what exactly did Jesus teach? It's exactly the things we talked about at the beginning. Love God, love your neighbor. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. What kind of righteousness is God looking for through the Gospel of Matthew? The kind of righteousness that would try to spare a young girl's reputation, even though at that time you thought she had done wrong. That was Joseph's story at the very beginning of Matthew. And so I would like to suggest that reading the Sermon on the Mount is about learning how to live in the kind of righteousness, with the kind of righteousness that exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees.